how did you desexualize your brain and transform your life on a personal level? Was there a moment where you just said, enough, I won't do this anymore? Or was it an amalgamation of things? What was
Yeah,
that for you on a personal level?
yeah, it's a great question. It goes back to that university lab that I was working in, trying to figure out the meaning of life. Do I believe in God? And when I did ultimately conclude, okay, God is real, and for me it was Christianity. I'm going to commit my life to Jesus. I knew that I had to make some lifestyle changes because I was not really living that life up until that point. And most of those lifestyle changes came relatively easy. And I always told myself, oh, pornography, I'm sure I'll stop watching one day. I remember telling myself that as a teenager and even in university, I'll stop watching whenever I need to.
I said that
Um,
for decades, literally
dude,
decades. That exact. I'll
yeah,
stop when I'll stop. I'll stop. I'll stop.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially like, in university, I mean, I planned my days around it. I was like, oh, it's just helping me cope with stress now, as if
Yeah.
life gets less stressful, as you go on. Like I was totally misled and I had no idea. So I made my decision. It's like, okay, I'm done. I'm done with this stuff. And I think I went 3 days and it was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to up it. So the only thing I knew how to do at that point was willpower. It was like willpower and I'm gonna pray more. And so I did those
Ooh.
things and eventually I got to like a week. But a couple months in is like, man, this is crazy. I didn't think it was this hard. And that's when I started to just realize, okay, this is a real problem. Josh, it took 5 years from that season before I finally experienced what I would describe as freedom from pornography. And there is a difference between sobriety and freedom, and we can get into that. But I'm talking about actual freedom where it's like, okay, this doesn't have a stronghold in my life anymore.
Mm.
The first 3 years, I was doing all the things that I said earlier on the show that you shouldn't do. It was trying to find the quick fixes. It was behaviorally focused. It was internet filters. It was really poorly constructed accountability systems. It was totally short term. And so I would go a week. Eventually, I could go maybe a couple weeks, maybe even a couple months. But something always came back because that root system was still there. It was still at play. There were wounds in my heart that were still wounded. There were issues in my belief systems that were still there. Like I didn't actually deal with the things underneath the surface. The
Mm.
last 2 years of recovery is where I started to do the work, start to work through trauma, went through a really deep process of forgiveness, started to understand some of my origin story and some parts of my past that contribute to my sexual development. And that's when I found real healing. That's when it wasn't just that I wasn't watching less. In fact, I started to think about that less. It's that my whole view of sexuality changed. It's that I start to see people differently. And I had such a high value for myself that I couldn't stomach the thought of objectifying another person. Like it was all these micro shifts that took place at an internal level that eventually led to this place where not watching porn was just an inherent byproduct. It just felt normal to not watch it. And so I had my last slip February 2016, I think it was. And so it took time to get there. It was a lot of back and forth. I wish it was like a one and done and I was there, but for me, it was a real process and a real journey of trying everything under the sun and only in the last little bit really identifying the things that actually move the needle forward.
How much of the you talked about wounding, which I think is really important. We had John Wineland on the show, and I remember he was sitting here and he was crying.
Mm,
And he said, the wound is actually where we can serve from. If we have the wisdom to not let our wound cloud our wisdom. And I wonder
mm.
for you, what was the wound like with your father? And how did that play into pornography itself?
Man, good question. The wound, so I would say fathers are most responsible for instilling identity. And I talked about this earlier, my sense of self was very much predicated on performance. And so there was this thing of me that felt like if I perform well, my dad will love me. And the what really made this debilitating is that I transferred that paradigm of relating with my father to my relationship with God. And so with God, it was the same. It was all about doing these things that look spiritual. It was all about behaving a certain way, acting a certain way. It was really performance driven. But I'll tell you,
There's a term for that. Sorry to interrupt you. There's a term for that, spiritual narcissist.
no
Someone
way.
that
I haven't heard
loves to,
that.
yeah, someone that loves to look spiritual. My friend
Oh,
JP Sears
interesting.
makes fun of people like that. It just says he's a comedian.
He does it
Spiritual
very well.
narcissists. On the outside, they're so spiritual and they're wearing the jewels and the beads and everything, but when you really talk to them, they have zero spiritual depth. So I digress. I
Yeah.
had to say that because we'll put in the show notes. Spiritual narcissism is
There you
real, y'all.
go. Okay, I learned something. What I was gonna say is, truthfully, the greatest healing actually happened in my relationship with my mom. Is it okay if I go into that a little bit?
Oh, please. Wow. So it wasn't the father wound. It was more
No,
the mother wound that was the
no.
origin.
And truthfully, in most of our clients, we see a lot more mom issues than dad issues. And well, I'll tangent just slightly, and then I'll get to this. Um, Pornhub, the world's largest porn site, they every year do a year in review and they release data about, what people have been watching, how long they've been watching, where they're watching from, all that kind of stuff. Which, by the way, we've been catering this conversation to men. But the Pornhub insights would suggest that for every two guys watching pornography, there's a woman watching. So very much a
Wow.
female issue as
Wow.
well. Yeah.
And that's
Uh,
recent data?
yeah, that's reason. Well, that trend's been existing for probably a few years now, but yeah, like as recent as 2023's data, it was 36% of all viewers were women.
That's so surprising. I would
Yeah.
never have thought that.
Yeah.
Well,
So
this
it's
is why science can help us spiritually grow if we use it in a conscious way.
this is why we know that pornography is not about being sexual, right? Because that was always the thing. It was like, oh, guys watch because there's way more sexual than women and whatever. And it's like, no, porn addiction is an intimacy disorder. Like this is people trying to get their needs for intimacy met, and men and women both have those needs. Anyways, I digress. If you look at the stats, the viewership, in the top five keywords, year after year after year is mom related searches, whether it's like MILF content, stepmom, all that kind of stuff. And what the research would suggest, the more clinical psychology research would suggest, is that where we are the most wounded or the most deficient is often reflected in the nature of the content that we are drawn to. So why are so many viewers online
Mm.
looking for this content? Because of mother wounds, because they have maternal wounds. So for me, I have an amazing mom. She immigrated from India, had an arranged marriage to my dad. Another story for another day. They spoke for 10 minutes
Wow.
before they got engaged to each other. Yeah.
Wow.
Barely knew each other. And so she immigrated to Canada. My dad was already living here for a few years. He was an immigrant as well. And so, yeah, so she moved overseas to basically live with a stranger, set up her life here. And truthfully, my mom was always there for me growing up, just an incredible woman. Um, One of the things about my mom is, and part of this is Indian culture and part of this is just her, but she's a much more reserved persona, doesn't express herself a ton. And I always knew she loved me, but it was implicit, if that makes sense.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
when I was working through some of these more core root issues, one of the things I discovered is that I actually grew up most of my life feeling a degree of neglect from my mom. Not that she was neglectful in an overt sense, but rather she didn't express love to me in a way that I needed it, which was, words, verbal affirmation, physical touch, some of those things that, a little boy is looking for. And having that deficiency ultimately led to chasing girls and pornography in
Yeah.
my high school years, which then developed into the addiction. A lot of it was sort of trying to scratch that itch. It was trying to satisfy those deep core needs that had gone unmet in my childhood. And most of recovery for me was, like I said, getting 1% better every day. It was very rare that I had like a huge breakthrough moment. I wasn't able to quit cold turkey. But I can tell you there was one particular moment I had where I felt different. I felt different in my body. I felt different in my spirit. I felt different in my mind. Something shifted. And it was the day that I forgave my mom for that experience of neglect when I was a kid. And I remember I had somebody walking me through it. I think it was a therapy session, and I walked out and I was lighter. My shoulders were relaxed. Like
Huh.
something had shifted, and so this whole parent wounding thing is a really big deal, and hopefully drives home the point that like it's not the sexual things. It's not those things that drive us to engage in things like pornography compulsively. It's often the much more fundamental psychological roots of trauma, parent-child relationships, our sense of self and identity and all those things. And so for me, it really the clinching piece or one of the big final pieces for me was actually working through that stuff with my mom.
Hey, if you loved that clip you just saw, watch the full video. That clip was just a taste, just a piece, the tip of the freaking iceberg of what you just witnessed and what you just felt. Click the link on this screen, subscribe to the podcast, click the link on this screen if you're vibrating, if you're resonating, if you feel what I'm putting down.